And don't be afraid to shout or scream or anything during the presentation. Most of this is just a quick background on who I am and my perspective in relation to these tools and Adobe and stuff like that. I'm an outsider. I do a lot of generative artwork. I write my own applications. I integrate it with other applications and stuff like that. So I do work occasionally for Adobe, but I'm not exclusive to their products. So the most important thing probably to know about me is that the question of momentum is really, really important to me in regards to not only trying to sustain a livelihood. I have a 13-year-old daughter, I have a girlfriend, house, and all that stuff that kind of gets introduced into your life as you go on. So, trying to balance that challenge with doing the stuff that you love is something that I constantly explore. And that's one of the reasons why, for the most part, I kind of focus in on not only creating my own applications, but also leveraging features and functions from Photoshop or Illustrator, Maya. I'm looking into integrating basically anything with a socket connection. Boom, I'm in there and I want to mess with it if the features complement the type of artwork that I'm interested in creating. So here's a good example. I was working on my own painting application that emulated natural media, and I decided to create one on my own when I was creating this application as well, with the idea that I really wanted to be able to record brushstrokes and capture that magic, because looking at a Pollock painting to me was as inspirational as watching the movie and watching him get crazy in front of that canvas. And so what I found was there were a lot of creative bottlenecks that I ran into, and the first one was in relation to color. And so pretty much color and brushstrokes define my professional life of since about '92. And one of the things I came up with was this idea that there's all these beautiful color palettes that are around us, and I typically create this inspiration folder on my hard drive, and I'll save all my images in there. And I was looking in that one day, and I said, what? There's all these great colors. What am I going to do with it? And then I went to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and when I was standing in front of one of her paintings, I was just blown away. And I was looking at all these colors just kind of abstracted outside of it, and I was trying to arrange it in my mind, and who's most popular, etc. And all these pixels crashed down on the floor around me. And so I had no way to really abstract that and use it in a practical way. So I came up with this algorithm that basically does that. So what you see here, this is inthemy.com. And I had it as a private database that I used for a while, and I decided to make it public. The idea is that you go through, you can look at the artist by alphabet, you can select their painting if you wanted to, and see not only the visualization of the colors, organized based on popularity, but see a visualization of it over here as well. And what we're seeing here are colors that are plotted based on hue, saturation, brightness. So hue on the x-axis, and saturation brightness along the Y. And it'll also do cool things. It'll show us relationships of his stuff over time. And I think one of the coolest things that I discovered in this was, go down to Rothko real quick. There's a lot of hidden information in this. And so if we look at Rothko's paintings that I have within the database, we notice this progression over time. So we go from 51 to 53. And as we progress down through the time, the saturation levels get darker as his emotional state gets darker as well. And so as he gets closer to ending his life, we get very dark in the saturation brightness levels of his color palettes. I thought that was really interesting. I think there's further analysis that can be done in relation to Georgia O'Keeffe's painting as her sight begins to go, and there's a lot of different ways we can look at that. But for me, the importance here was, okay, abstract the colors, and how do we repurpose those colors? So here I have the capability to actually download those color palettes as what's called an ASE format, an Adobe Swatch Exchange. It works in most of the Adobe products. I went to that format just because it was one format. It was a lot easier to get into a bunch. I also did an XML version of this for Painter. Actually, this one's for Flash. There is a Painter version, processing, of course, After Effects as well. And what I found was, in my creative workflow, when I'm painting, the first problem was, okay, I have to stop, and it's not like the real world where I have this palette and I can mix all my colors together really quickly, right? I have all these nice little boxes, but they don't know anything about each other, and so there's a lot of disconnect there. There's a lot of unintelligence in relation to the swatches that exist. And so in the creative process, there's also, when I created this tool, I still have to go through like 4 or 5 different steps to get into my paint application. Whether it's mine or Illustrator, Photoshop, it didn't really matter, or even processing, right? I still have multiple steps to take. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to eliminate some of those steps, and just out of frustration, right? And I created this. I discovered this thing called ExtendScript. Okay, and how many people know about who knew about ExtendScript before this conference? All right, that's not bad, like 5–10%. That's on average, that's pretty typical. And what I found in relation to that is that Adobe really didn't put any marketing muscle behind ExtendScript. And I speak at a lot of different like Photoshop and Flash conferences, and that's pretty consistent across the board. Anyway, what ExtendScript basically was created to do originally, and we'll go through the history of it because I think that's a really cool story, is automation, right, and extensibility of the applications. And so here I discovered that, one, I can create these scripts that I could run within Illustrator that would control different features and functions within Illustrator, but I can also embed Flash pieces into it. So this piece that we're looking at is actually, all I did was I repurposed I adjusted the GUI. Same code, PHP, my Swift is talking to PHP, and then it's talking to the database, and it's pulling all this information back and forth. I thought, oh my God, the potential there was great. And so here what I'm doing is, I'm searching my database, and once I like it, I click on the magic Illustrator button, and it automatically talks to Illustrator and says, hey, swatches, let's update all the colors through this color array. And once I've done that, all that data I can do like we just watched here. Let me play it again. I'm loading the script right here. And I'm simply saying in the script, let's go ahead and sort it based upon brightness. So I've got a lot of potential there. And then in December of last year, my world came crashing down. Essentially what happened was the latest version of the Mac OS came out, and they redefined the rules of how these palettes, these floating windows within programs like Illustrator regroup. And so essentially what you saw, what you would see is basically just a black screen. There wasn't much there. There'd be a lot of redraw issues and stuff like that. And I got a call from John Knapp from Adobe, and he said, look, I like what you're doing. We have this project, and I want to introduce you to it and get your feedback on it and let you kick the tires. And what essentially that project was it was the idea that, okay, ExtendScript and embedding Flash within these windows is cool, but there was a better way to do it, and they realized that. And they created these 2 new tools, and these tools they're called Patch Panel and Switchboard, and I'll get into more details in a minute about what there are, but in general, Patch Panel allows you to create these Flash plugins that run within the Creative Suite, so Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. And with a good hack, you can make it work within After Effects as well, but there's no documentation for that. And there's something also called Switchboard. What Switchboard allows you to do is create these AIR applications. Now, quick question, how many people know what or don't know what an AIR application is? Okay, cool. And an AIR application basically is, it's like a hybrid executable that's cross-platform independent, right? Or that's platform independent. And so you can create it with Flash, you can create it with Flex Builder, and instead of publishing a Swift, you publish this executable, and it gives you an installer. You can install that. The only thing that the end user needs in order to be able to run that executable, and this is one of the catches, is you have to have the AIR player running on your computer. So AIR player plus your application, you're good to go. And so what this AIR application does is, it's a standalone, anything you can do with an action script, it'll do that. It'll interface with all of your internet content databases, data streams, anything you have going on there. Plus, it'll integrate with your desktop as well. So Switchboard, now basically you can imagine your own standalone creative application, and you have this pipeline, which is Switchboard, and that allows you to connect and drive not only Photoshop, Illustrator, etc. InDesign, but you can actually connect that, and I think this is where it becomes really valuable, to any other not third party, but any other application, whether it's Open Frameworks or Maya or whatever, via a socket connection. So what does that really mean? To me, that means that I can create my own application, okay, and I can look a la carte at all these other applications. I go, oh man, I really like the color capability within Illustrator. I really like the painting capability within Maya. So instead of creating my own painting engine, that emulates natural media, because Maya has this really cool generative capabilities with brushstrokes. I can define particle systems in relation to it. I can do all kinds of crazy stuff. I now take this, this hybrid approach. So, with that said, I want to tell you the story about Michael Domling and Bernd Paradis. And basically, they're both Adobe employees, and they're the heroes of my story. And I still have that in this mouth. I did that at 4 a.m. and when I was in London last year. I should have updated it. Anyway, I think it's really interesting because it's the story of how ExtendScript came to life and how Touch Panel and Switchboard came to life. And there's this cool dynamic that goes along in the course of our lives, and we can really never predict what path flow it's going to go. But when these entities cross, I think more things come out of that. And so, back in the late 1990s, Michael and Bernd were both working at Star Division. And how many people remember Star Division? Okay. Star Division. Michael was basically working on Star Basic at that time. He created Star Basic. He did a lot of stuff with Star Calc. And Bernd was working on Star Writer. And following that, as things started to get a little shaky at Star Division, wasn't sure what was going to happen right before Sun bought them, Bernd went ahead and went to work for this company called Pink. And during that time, shortly after that, Pink folded. It was a quick turnaround, and the CEO actually left Pink, went over and started a new company called GoLive, and in that process, he brought over Michael to work for him on Cyber Studio. And how many people remember Cyber Studio? I think it's still around, but essentially it was like before Dreamweaver. It was this really great WYSIWYG editor. You can switch back and forth between the design and the other view, and it had a really nice SDK in the background. And that's essentially what Michael did on this project. He worked he created he had this, and on the weekend toy project that he had this JavaScript interpreter that he developed, and he basically brought that into Cyber Studio, and that was Cyber Studio's SDK. And so that moment, that little fun project that Michael worked on really is going to define the story of how all this technology kind of grew over time. So Pink folded, Bernd went to work over at Adobe on the InDesign team, and then shortly afterward, of course, GoLive was swallowed up by Adobe, and in that process, Michael started doing work on the After Effects team with the JavaScript, introducing basically what they call ExtendScript. And essentially what ExtendScript means is it's nothing more than Adobe's extension of JavaScript. And it is the JavaScript interpreter that he had worked on earlier, and it had evolved to this point where the After Effects team saw what Michael did on the Cyber Studio team, and they said, that's really cool. Wouldn't it be cool if between these two tweens, keyframes basically, wouldn't it be cool if we could add script that actually moved and changed, the different objects that we have within that world? And that's how ExtendScript basically was born within Adobe. During that time, Macromedia, of course, the competitor of Adobe at that time, had Flash out. It was doing really well. ActionScript was coming to life, and Adobe wanted to counter that with live motion. And live motion essentially was it's a Flash authoring environment, and they look at ActionScript, and what they really want to do is they wanted to kind of extend or bring ActionScript within that world, and that's where ExtendScript and Michael came into play. Following that, Michael went to work on Atmosphere, and that was, it was a game engine, all done in ExtendScript, and it had some really cool physics stuff, which we know today as Acrobat 3D. Photoshop, Illustrator, their need in relation to ExtendScript was they had VBScript that worked on Windows, they had AppleScript on the Mac, but they didn't have this cross-platform solution. And so what they wanted to do was introduce JavaScript into that mix, and so ExtendScript filled that need pretty well, and transfers over to InDesign because InDesign was built from the ground up with scripting. It's one of the most advanced as far as scripting programs that Adobe has. And then Creative Suite came about with this idea that you could combine all these applications together, but the question was, what was the glue that tied them all together? And so ExtendScript basically, via Bridge, connected these dots. And out of Bridge, we have Bridge Talk, which is the tunnel that makes everything communicate together. And Burn comes back to work on Bridge Talk, and they create Patch Panel, which, like I said before, allows you to create Flash plugins for these different applications, and Switchboard, which is basically Bridge Talk on AIR. So, pretty. I think it's kind of interesting. This one concept that Michael had has grown and grown over time, and it has gone from application to application. And we're going to leverage that as much as possible to integrate with applications that are beyond this, beyond the Adobe Suite. And here's a quick preview, basically, of like at the very bottom, Patch Panel, Switchboard, what they're compatible with. So again, ExtendScript was originally created as this idea to automate and extend the Creative Suite applications or the Adobe applications. It had the capability, as we saw in my Illustrator demo, of being able to pull up a window. You can add GUIs to it. You can embed the Flash player into that. And it's used pretty extensively within Adobe from what I understand. And again, this is an outside perspective, so a lot of this is just speculation, and don't quote me on it. I know it's going to be on the internet somewhere. Adobe is going to do it. Just kidding. So internal testing to drive APIs and modules, and they also expose a lot of the apps, objects to third-party scripters, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Patch Panel really was this idea to create, at first it was like, oh, okay, now that Macromedia and Adobe have merged, let's take ExtendScript, let's take ActionScript, and let's combine these two worlds together, and let's see what we get. Well, that was a prototype concept, and it had to be discontinued, and in place of it, Michael came up with this idea of being able to create ActionScript wrappers for ExtendScript. And why would that be advantageous? It'd be advantageous because instead of using ExtendScript Toolkit, which is the program that you use to write these ExtendScripts, you can actually use applications like Flex Builder in order to create it. So you get all these beautiful advantages if you go that way, like auto code completion and very sophisticated debugging, etc. So that was the idea behind Patch Panel. It's compatible with both CS3 and CS4 versions of Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. Switchboard, again, it's the standalone executable application that can kind of control these applications from the outside. And I think, we'll get into, okay, I won't go down. Yeah, it's a good script. It's a good story. So originally it was all about automation and this idea just to speed up these applications. But what I'm really interested in doing is leveraging the fact that we can control these applications via code and use those for creative purposes. And to my advantage, right, when I was working in some of these other programs, I discovered that when I render these out, they would be flat files, right? They'd be PNGs or whatever, TIFFs, and I would have to use some sort of tiling mechanism in order to get really large. I want to go large. I want to go 3 by 6 feet. I want to go 10 by 100 feet if I want to. I don't want to be limited in that space, and I also don't want to go back to the days where Photoshop, right before Photoshop had layers, right? And I don't know how many people used Photoshop 2. Are there any old-timers in here? Yeah, right. You remember the days when a client would come up and they'd say, oh, you know what, that looks really great, but can you make that circle that's underneath that text, can you move it over 20 pixels and can you change the color? And you'd be like, no problem. I'll get back to you in 1 day, right? So you'd have to go, if you didn't say about multiple versions, you have to go back and change it up. For me, I like to be able to go in, and that's just a personal preference. I like to be able to go in and touch these objects later on and change them over time. I want to be able to map in different data to it and move them if they already exist. But again, that's just a personal preference. So some of the trade-offs to using ExtendScript, etc., are really, okay, there's an API for plugin developers for these tools, right? There is also something called the DOM, which is the Document Object Model. And that's all the objects that are exposed to ExtendScript coders. And what does that mean? Okay, so a DOM basically are objects like, if you're in Illustrator and you have your symbols panel, the symbols panel is actually an object. And so you can do symbols.length and find out how many symbols are within there, or swatches.length. And so that's essentially what the DOM is. It's a scripting version of the API. Now the problem with that is that a lot of, probably about, and this is just my guess of using it quite a bit, but about 80% of the actual API, the true API, and all the functionality of the application is exposed to DOM. So scripters have about 20% of the application that they can't touch. Now, to our advantage, Photoshop has this little plugin that allows us to actually watch this stuff in the background, and if it's not in a DOM, we have the capability of extending it ourselves. Illustrator doesn't have that capability, so that's a pretty major trade-off, I think, in my mind. And there are ways to hack it, like we can write our own plugin that basically watches for stuff and tells our Flash plugins or our AIR applications what's going on in the environment. So there's that capability. And I think one thing that hasn't been exploited at this point, which really excites the heck out of me, is this idea that we can actually listen. Okay, two-way communication, right? What is that all about? Okay, right now I can tell Illustrator or Photoshop, I can say, okay, hey guys, I want you to move this circle that's on the stage and create 100 variations of you, and I want you to put you in these exact positions, right? And I can actually ask for some information to be returned to me, right? So it's not really communication yet, in my mind. We can do this thing that allows us to, there's all these events that are within Photoshop and Illustrator that are being fired. Okay, this tool is selected. They have just finished drawing with the pen tool. We can actually, through a nice thing called the external object, we can begin to listen to those things so that when they happen, we can react to them in intelligent ways. And that's one of the ways that Scriptographer works. They basically have a plugin that he created that allows you, I think it was who developed Scriptographer. And if you haven't seen it, it's a pretty cool tool for Illustrator, and it does all kinds of funky stuff on top of what Illustrator has. So in my mind, basically, it's like having a Flash layer that lives within either Illustrator or Photoshop and can react to whatever you're doing. And so the design capabilities there, the generative capabilities, are pretty exciting. So here's a quick example of Photoshop. I have a Flash plugin running within Photoshop. It's doing the audio analysis, and it's driving the brush stroke and to each piece of audio. So amplitude of each instrument is mapped to the speed of the brush stroke. And this is a piece that I did for my friend Joshua, he has these plugins. Joshua Davis has these plugins for Flash that allow you to create dynamic abstraction for generative art. I use it interchangeably, I guess. So what I want to do is I kind of wanted to show him what the capabilities are within Illustrator. And the reason why I wanted to do that was because at the time we had limitations in generating artwork within Flash exclusively, and that was this idea that you're limited to this type of the screen size that you could export, right? 2880 by 2880. You could do tiling a little bit after that, and since that time it's gotten a little bit better. You can still do tiling, etc., but it's not to the level where I'm really happy with. In addition to that, gradients are really difficult, right? When you go from Flash to like a PostScript file. And so what this is basically doing, it's an AIR application, and the first thing it did when it launched, it said, hey, Illustrator, how many layers do you have, and what are the names of your layers? And based upon that, it's going to automatically build this menu here. And I pull down the menu and I say, okay, canvas layer, because I know within the canvas layer, I have these sprites that live on the stage. And then it says, okay, how many graphic objects do we have on the stage? And then it automatically creates this accordion off here. And forgive the UI, this is just a quick experiment to see what's capable here. And so here I'm basically, I've also talked to the symbols library. I got all the names of the symbols. I can talk to swatches and get all the colors. I'm varying the colors up here. I'm finding out what the graphic styles are. So there's some cool capabilities here, and it's definitely going to require further exploration on my part to really find out what the best way is to use it in relation to the type of art that I want to create, but I think there's potential. So ExtendScript, patch panel, switchboard, what are they good for? Of course, generating artwork. We can basically, why the heck would I want to do this in the first place? I can integrate all the capabilities of ActionScript 3, all the capabilities there, and all the capabilities of all these applications together and make my own thing, right? Here's another example. This is a little more practical. This is a piece that I worked on with Gary Carvel, and this was for Etsy. And the idea was, we had this poster contest, and there was over 1,000 different entries, and the objective was to be able to print, these dynamically generated posters. And so, 16 images per poster, 16,000 images. That would require me to go into Illustrator and position, scale, add the proper titles, color correction, CSS, all that stuff, right? Download them. There's no way in how I want to do that by hand, right? So I wrote this Flash plugin, and essentially what it does is it does this cool thing. It talks to Bridge in the background. And says, and the reason why I'm talking to Bridge is because it has this FTP client already built into Bridge. And it says, okay, let's automatically download all these images so that I don't get a pop-up every single time and says, do you want to save this image? So it downloads them, and then automatically places them for me, and then it'll save out high-resolution TIFF, JPEG, whatever I want, and also update the .ai version number if I want to. And so what would have taken me weeks and weeks, actually once I ran this application, it took me just a small amount of time to actually execute. So who uses these tools? At this point, obviously a lot of in-house stuff within Adobe. There are some open source design communities that are coming out there, and I'll reference those in a little while. And there are some third-party developers that are starting to pop up here and there. Not a lot, because I think it still exists within labs.adobe.com. But I look forward to seeing some work by some new artists in the future, and hopefully just a couple of you guys will be interested in that. Here's another example that was created by Adobe for Photoshop, and jump past here real quick. Okay, this it's called Configurator, and the idea here is that, okay, as these tools evolve, they become more and more complex. Tool palettes, more tool palettes, more tool palettes. So, and are they actually fitting my need? case may be that they're not. And so what we can do here basically is we're going to go ahead and say, this is an AIR application. We're going to go ahead and click and drag the features and functions that I typically use over. So let me go ahead and click, let's see, lasso tool. And let me go ahead and just do fill bucket, right? And before that, I think I'm going to, what I want to do is I typically, let's say in this example, I typically want to create a new document and I want to select a specific area and then I want to go ahead and fill that area. You know, it doesn't really matter, but I think you'll get the point. So I'm going to go ahead and save this panel, actually export it. And I got this saved. Oh, did you guys hear that? Yeah. That was my stomach growling. I must be hungry. All right, it exported successfully. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go into CS4. This only works with CS4 right now. And I'm going to relaunch it. We only have to relaunch it the first time when we save the file to this directory within Photoshop, because it only scans it at the very beginning. So I'm going to go to Window, again, Extensions, woohoo, open that up, and now I have this flash panel, right? And it's scaled if I wanted to. It has all the behaviors of what a panel should have, what you would expect in a panel. I'm going to go ahead and say click on New, creates a new document for me. Selected my lasso and fill. Very cool, right? It's that easy to build those. So that's one example, or actually another example of these tools in action. I love this question. I'm not an Adobe employee by these answers. What surprised me just in general about the use of these tools, Adobe's lack of marketing behind ExtendScript, Patch Panel, and Switchboard. It's surprising to me because what you have is you have these enormous applications with millions of lines of code. And there are a list of features and functions each one of us have that we would love these tools to have included in them for the next build. You know, and so there are times where some of those might make it into the next build. There are more often times, at least for me, where they're not included. And so what that suggests is that there's this need, there's a space to be able to extend the creative suites themselves. And so I'm surprised they're not pushing this more because this is definitely a do-it-yourself approach to extending those applications. And also the low numbers of generative artists that are actually using this at this point also is somewhat surprising to me, but we'll see if that changes. For now, it's a nice space to be working in. So if you want to online communities and where you would download these are available at labs.adobe.com, and just do a search for both Patch Panel and Switchboard. And let me jump into the actual applications and give you a quick show and tell to show you how easy it is to create, to communicate with these applications. Okay, so ExtendScript Toolkit comes installed if you ordered, if you have Photoshop or Illustrator, I think it's CS3 and above. It's definitely installed for free on your computer. It's typically in like a utilities/Adobe Utilities directory. And so I'm just going to do a real quick alert and code. And the syntax here feels a lot like JavaScript, feels a lot like processing to me, and a lot of ECMAScripts just in general. It feels like an early version of ActionScript, so if you're comfortable in those languages, it's really easy to pick up. And I'm just going to target for right now Adobe Photoshop CS4. And I'm going to run it, and boom, there we go. That was it. Online code, not bad. Now, if I want to do the same with creating an AIR application that talks to Photoshop. It's going to involve a little bit more, but once you actually have the template in place, it's pretty easy to get up and running. So a real quick review of what's going on in this code. There's a couple of things that you'll always see within switchboard and switchboard applications, and that is when the application actually launches, we have to initialize it. So on creation complete, I've imported my library here, and that library is nothing more than SWIP, SWC, which is a flex library. It's a container for all the switchboard code wrapped up, so I don't even have to think twice about it. So on creation complete, it initializes it, basically opens up that tube from the AIR application to the Creative Suite application. And you'll also see on closing, what I want to do is just close that connection between those two worlds when I'm done running this application. In addition to that, you'll see this little thing called Bridge Talk, which I typically put just, I call it send through Bridge Talk because this Bridge Talk is the name of this connection between these two worlds. And all I'm going to do basically is send a string as a message from my AIR application to my target application. And I'm also going to put an onResult on AIR and in there so I can get data back so that there's two-way communication between those two worlds, right? So what I'm going to do here, let's go ahead and I'm going to drag and drop a button over here. And when that button is clicked, I'm going to go ahead and call a method. We're going to call that method make magic. Okay. And go back to my source code. There's a private function. Make magic. And then I'm going to, just to speed things up here, it's not a big deal, but I'm a bad typer when I'm doing presentations. So my string basically that I'm creating is alert, and dynamically what I'm doing is I'm pulling in the text that I want to pass from my AIR application to Photoshop. I'm pulling that from the text box this text box that exists right here. And that text box ID is called outgoing. So whatever I type in here, when I click on this button, it's going to get that, wrap it up in this string, and then it's going to send it through that method that I have called send through bridge talk. Okay? So I'm saving it, publishing it. And we'll just say woohoo. And there it is. Okay. Same framework that I always use, and that's how we establish two-way communication between these two workloads. Yes. 3? Yeah. Okay. Let's get to the good stuff now. A couple more examples. Here, this plugin basically is in Photoshop and it's doing an absolute difference. How many people know that there's an animation timeline within Photoshop? Okay, that's cool. That's more than half. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, first frame and X number of frames in front of it, let's go to compare the two, let's do an absolute difference between them, and let's find out what pixels are actually moving. And based upon the pixels that are moving, let's go ahead and apply an effect to only those pixels that are moving. Oh, this is so fun. There's 2 more examples I want to show you guys. Let's see if we can pull this off. I'm in Photoshop CS4, right? I'm going to go down to this extension and go this one. say, was that me? Was that my stomach? Okay, so that, we'll get back to that. I'll show you the video. We'll go to my website and check it out. The idea basically, though, is that there's this server, we've got a server that talks via Bluetooth to the computer, and you can pull in a 3D object within the Flash panel and draw the 3D object, a separate 3D object that lives within the stage. And so I think there's great painting capabilities there in the future that I'd like to explore more, but not today. Okay, just to give you an idea of artwork that can be generated from this, AIR application writes this painting script that's run within Painter and starts to generate these because Painter has this really beautiful ability to emulate natural media, right? The only catch with Painter is that it's cumbersome in order to reverse engineer the scripts that Painter is actually using. And if you want more information on that, on how to actually do this, feel free to email me, and I'll send you some tutorial files. This is driving Illustrator based upon the data visualization and the color analysis. Here's another example of just adding flocking behaviors within Flash to symbols that exist within Illustrator and generating 6x6 feet prints from them. Gravity, this is deformation of three-dimensional objects so that you begin to get this expressiveness within the objects. This is a particle collision with springs attached to it, the end result of it. And something that I like to call my Chihuly piece. It's like glass, and for me, one of the paths that I'm taking is definitely heading towards glass, and that is, the question is, how do I get from my applications and not recreate them over and over to the point where I can actually create either CNC master models, get it milled, and create actual glass sculptures or metal sculptures or whatever. Let me see here. This is one magic tool. All right, so the idea is that the AIR application through the socket connection can actually control events that are happening within Maya. And so I'm doing audio analysis and I'm generating the shapes dynamically, and then I'm animating the shapes based upon the characteristics of the audio. And I'll end with this video. So more information if you want to follow up on any more information in relation to this. Websites are located here. Email me afterward. I'll send you to the tutorials if you want. And thank you guys very much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.